all of you. I'm assuming you're mainly UK based, but if you're not, most of what I'm talking about will be relevant anyway. You'll just probably need to switch the months if I talk about a particular month or season. Anyway, as most of you have got a supermarket plant, we're going to break it the morning into little sections. So we're going to do a sowing and growing, which is the first section. Then we're going to do aftercare, and then I'll talk about varieties. So let's get started. So those of you who've got a basil plant, get it to the ready. I'm just going to position this so hopefully you can see actually what I'm doing. Right, so I'm sure that most of you at some stage in your life have bought a supermarket plant like this. And you'll think, oh yes, that's nice. I'm not going to buy the basil pre-cut in the little bag that's £1. What a waste of money. I'm going to buy my own growing plant. Well, as you pull the plastic down, you might look and think, oh, it's a really healthy plant. It's loads of leaves. If you look really carefully, you'll actually see that it's actually loads of stems, which means it's not a plant at all. It's about 25 seedlings crammed into a small pot of compost. So what I'm going to do is get some compost ready next to you and a small pot. So these pots are quite small, but I'm going to actually suggest that you split up this plant. Do this very carefully. It's actually quite tricky because I dread to think how long this has been in the pot, and you are going to have to break some roots. And can you see how tough that is as I'm pulling that off? So do this with me while I'm doing it. You are going to have to break some of the fibrous roots. That was quite difficult to put that back in there. So I've really pulled, and I've still ended up with 2 seedlings. So I'm going to have to very carefully prise one away. That's better. So I still managed to keep a fair bit of root on both of them. And if you look very carefully, you can see all the way down the stem that there are lots of little shoots coming off either side. So this one is smaller. So actually, if you had to choose which one to pot up, I would pot the smaller one up, because you're going to end up with about 25 plants here. So some might have to go on the compost if you haven't got room for them. So if you get down to a choice, I would always pot up the smaller one. And if you look carefully, can you see there's another little seedling? So that's another little one there that you could pot up. So I'm going to pull that off carefully so I can show you. Look, there's a lovely long root on that. Can you see that? So I'm going to fill my little pot with some compost, and multi-purpose compost is absolutely fine. You don't need any clever compost. I'm very aware that it's difficult at the moment to buy any compost. If it's sold as potting compost, that would be absolutely fine. Multi-purpose is the best because obviously it's all in the name, multi-purpose. So I'm going to fill that. Always tap your pot to remove any air pockets. So that's down to about 3/4. Just see that. And then I'm just going to use the back of I'm going to use a back of a pencil to make a hole. And I'm just going to get water, just down the compost, not too much. Oops, looking at my show and tell for later. So a little bit of compost. You don't want to overwater just yet. And then make a little hole. Just try to do it so you don't damage too much root. And then pop your seedling into the pot, firm it down gently, and then just fill up and top up all around the edge with a little bit more compost. I'm just going to try and hold it. When you touch seedlings, this one is quite sturdy because it's quite tall, but the rule of thumb is to actually just touch the leaf and not the stem, because the stems can be quite brittle. So I think if we go back to this one, I would touch the leaf and not the stem. If I touch that stem, I'm going to damage it and break it and it will die. So always touch the leaves. This one is sturdy, so I'm actually okay to touch it. The backfill with a bit more compost. And there we go. And then I would normally say label, but I think you'll know this is basil. But if you want to label, I'm at the moment buying lots of wooden lolly sticks, and I just write on basil, just so that I know, but you will know because of the pungent smell. Pop that in, then add a little bit more water, but not too much, because you just want that root to settle in. Just damp enough. And that is going to be a basil plant that is going to sit in your greenhouse or your kitchen window ledge, and it's actually going to produce basil leaves, and lots of them for you, all summer, all the way through to the autumn. I'm going to talk about how I grow basil. I mean, obviously I have replanted basil like this before, but I also sow my own seeds. Now, it's not difficult. It's much, much cheaper. So a bag of basil seeds this was £1.50. It's actually quite good value. This is from Johnson's, but they vary from £1.50 or even 99p probably in Poundland to about £2.99. This is the variety that I've just potted on from the supermarket. It's sweet Genovese, sweet basil. It's the kind of common one that you usually see everywhere. And the seeds in it are really tiny, and really there's not much difference in what we've just done with the supermarket one. So you would fill your little pot with compost, just as I did just now. You give a little tap, take the air pockets out. You add a little bit of water, and then I'm just going to show you the seeds. They're quite small, but you actually get quite a lot of them in a seed packet. Now that's quite useful information, because a lot of people, when they buy a packet of seeds, sow the whole lot in one go. There's absolutely no need. Seeds, although they have a sell-by date, this one says 2022, I actually keep seeds for as long as they last, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, because seeds, they won't lose all their germination. They might lose 10% every year. And you'll know when it's time to give up, because nothing will germinate, but that might be year 4 or 5. So these seeds, can you see how tiny they are? Can you see that on the camera? They're really small. So already that small handful is probably about 20 basil plants. So, and I've got probably another 200-300 left in the packet. So I would literally just sprinkle them on dampened compost. I would water my compost, scatter them on. It doesn't matter how you sow them, just try and spread them if you can, but they're so tiny. Add a little bit of water, and then I normally do this in my greenhouse at the end of February, which is quite early, but I really want to get these lovely strong plants that I showed you behind me, because really as soon as the weather warms up, I want to be able to use my basil. I want, as long as I can, a long season from everything. So I do mine in the greenhouse, which is unheated, at the end of Feb. You can sow any time from the end of Feb all the way through to now. And then I give a little tap. Sometimes I might sprinkle a little bit more compost on top, but just a light dusting. I don't want to bury the seeds too much. And then I will just sit that, I will label it, here's one I made earlier, and I will just sit that on a shelf in my greenhouse. If it's really cold, which wasn't this winter, I might put a plastic bag over the top with a hole in, just to keep a little microclimate to keep it warmer. I might have a propagator. I don't have one, but some of you might. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. You just froze then when you were talking about the temperature and the winter. Could you just repeat it, please?
Yes. Okay. So I sow at the end of February, but if it's really cold, you could put a little plastic bag over the top of your pot. You could have a lid over your seed tray. It doesn't matter how you sow them. I mean, here's some I sowed earlier in a supermarket punnet, which I use instead of a seed tray. You can see how they've rammed together, but it doesn't actually matter because you can prise them up and pop them on. But if I'm using one of these, I save the base and use that as a lid. So I'm sort of creating my own propagator if sowing when it's quite cold. That's the first stage of sowing the seeds, and then 2 to 3 days you will see them germinate. So you've got a nice little load of seedlings, and the same goes to exactly the same that I did with the supermarket basil. You would very carefully, I'm just using my label, very carefully, but already look at the root on that. So you can see why the supermarket basil doesn't grow very well for a very long time, because each one needs a lot of space and room for that root. So I would then just pot it up like I did with my seedlings, with my seeds and my seedling. I would pot it up, make a hole with my lolly stick and bury it in and cover it back round. I touch the stem because it's a much firmer seedling than the little tiny one I found in the supermarket pot. And I would just put one per pot in that size. You don't need too many. So that's it. And then after probably, just thinking that was 2 weeks, the weather's really warm, they'll grow really quickly. So after about, here we are, another week, they'll grow quite quickly. So that was that size, and this is a week on. So you can see how quickly they take off. because they've just got room to grow. I'm going to remove this for one. I'm not sure how he got in there, but I'll take him out now. So, you know, that's the key. Give a basil room to grow and you'll have lots and lots and lots of basil leaves all summer. So that you can sow now. I said, what are we now? We're June. You could keep sowing to the end of June if you wish to keep some fresher plants going on later. But actually, if you sow some today, that'll be sufficient for you. Now, the compost, I said multi-purpose compost. You will need to give a little feed as well, but I'll talk about that in a while. I'll talk about watering. So basil, I've watered it in today. Let's say we'll talk about this, our supermarket seedling, because all the little ones I grow from seed catch up. So this one, I would water once a day. You don't want to overwater. Way to know whether watering or not is literally putting your finger on top of the surface of the compost, and if it comes up slightly damp with a bit of soil there, it's not too dusty, then you don't want to do any more water than that. So a rule of thumb is once a day. I water every evening just because it's easier. I know I'm going into the greenhouse, I know that's my job, and it's just something I then won't forget, because the worst thing is to go through all this potting up, looking after your seedlings, and then forgetting to water them. So try and put a routine, you know, put it at a time of day that you would normally go to your greenhouse. Evenings is the perfect time in my book, because the greenhouse has been warm all day, and the soil is warm, and it receives the water a lot better, and it soaks it in. And it's soaked in properly so that before night falls, these little roots aren't sitting in pools of water, because the one thing that basil hates is having damp roots, okay? The compost, I've said, is multi-purpose compost, but I would feed that, and what I use is I use a liquid seaweed feed. It doesn't have to be, this is just the one that I have. So I bought this from a garden centre last year. You don't need to use much. It's got a proper child-proof cap, and I put a little bit of a capful into a big 2-litre watering can, and I use that to feed my basil plants. Now, just to show you how important it is to feed, let's get one that's different colour. So the one I showed you earlier, the big basil, this gets fed once a week with my liquid seaweed. But I haven't fed these, and can you see the colour difference? One is a lot paler, so that is telling me that that needs a feed. So this has missed the feed, and they all need potted up, because look, I've got 5 seedlings in there, so they need to go into individual containers like this. But this just shows you, it's not that you can't eat and use the basil leaves, but what a difference that is in the colour. So this is way more pungent than those. In fact, I can hardly smell those by putting my nose in, but this, by even shaking the pot, I can smell the pungent aroma. So that's key to keeping your plants healthy all summer. You must feed, and actually that's a rule of thumb for most things in the garden. I don't know if all of you feed, and whether you have larger gardens that you grow things in as well, but that's also really important to give a feed. You don't have to use a liquid seaweed feed. You can make your own feed. You can soak comfrey in a bucket, or nettle tops. You can grab a handful, obviously with gloves on, soak it in a bucket for 2 weeks, drain it. It honks to high heaven, but it's a brilliant nitrogen-rich feed, so you could do that. Just once a week is the right amount of time. Don't overfeed, because then they'll grow so and fall over and die. The other thing that I think about the basil is that I've said to put them into pots. I've shown you how I grow mine in pots, but I also grow basil in the ground. And you don't have to grow it in a greenhouse. You can grow it outside the greenhouse or in a main bed if you prefer. I love growing it in the greenhouse because the leaves are definitely more tender. The stems are tender, the leaves are tender, and it is more pungent. I do grow them outside, but they're tougher. That's all there is. If you haven't got the space in the greenhouse, that's absolutely fine. But the reason for growing them in a greenhouse, other than tender leaves, is that they can act as an organic pest control with tomatoes. I think someone wrote in a question earlier on. So I always plant my basil around the base of each of my tomato plants, and I have rows of tomatoes in my greenhouse, and I also plant 3 basils next to each row. And what that does is this pungent aroma, I just smell now, keeps away the pests and other insects that can come in and invade your tomatoes. And also, it's a natural thing, isn't it, to go and pick your tomatoes in July and August, and oh, there's my basil. It's one job done in two, so it cuts down on time, which is always a good thing in my book. So that's another reason for growing in the greenhouse. And you'll see that basil grown, if you've got a raised bed, or if you've got big pots that you put your tomatoes in, you might use grow bag compost. That's absolutely fine for tomatoes too. You will see how tall the basil plants get. And in fact, early this morning, when I opened up my greenhouse, I checked on the basil that's growing next to my tomatoes, and one is over a foot tall, which is actually bigger than my tins I showed you. It's probably 1.5 times that height, and this is just the top of it. And this is the same variety that the supermarket plant is. So just as a comparison, this is just the top. I pinched out the tip of one plant. So this is why it's important to give them room to grow. I thought I'd just talk about how I could show you. I think somebody asked a question about how you could propagate different plants. Well, I'll just quickly show you now. This doesn't have to be, well, it could be used in the kitchen today for lunch, but if you wanted to make more plants, if you were sowing from seed and you didn't have your supermarket pot, take off the big leaves, take off the central growing tip, and you can put that in a little glass of water and leave that in the greenhouse on a window ledge, on a shelf, or kitchen on a window ledge, and that will produce little fibrous roots on the base, and you could pop that up as a new plant. Right, now going to move on to varieties. So as you've seen, I grow a purple and a green. And why do I do that? Because they have a slightly different flavour and because they look nice and they're fun. So the different varieties you can get is this supermarket one, and this is really the only one that you can get growing like this, is Sweet Genovese, which is the normal, more common basil, which is wonderful and grows as I've shown you, really lovely and big and gorgeous, and that's fine. But my favourite, as I keep showing you, is this wonderful one. Now this, it's Neapolitan basil, and it's renowned for having the largest leaves in the basil family. And just to show you how big that is, it is the size of my hand. Some people refer to it as a lettuce basil, but it is, I think, one of the best ones to grow. So that's another variety. Then there's a small leaf variety called basil bush, not basil brush, basil bush, and it's also known as a Greek basil, and that's much more of a small moundy plant. It wouldn't get as big as all these seedlings. It's probably be, well, maybe nearly as tall, and it's more of a round bush, and it's got tiny, tiny leaves. It's pretty, but to be honest, I'm not sure that I would grow that because I can't really use the leaves properly. Maybe I'd scatter them on something. I like a plant that's really going to work hard for me. And then you have the purples. And I grow the purple one here, my little one, which I just think is really attractive. So there are two types. So it's called purple or crimson basil or dark opal. So this one is purple and this one is dark opal. There's not much difference between them, but they've got a slightly more aniseedy flavour and texture. So they're quite good for Oriental, Thai, Asian dishes. You know, even in a Thai curry, they'd be really nice. They still smell of basil, but they've just got a more licorice acid flavour. They look nice, and sitting together, they sort of complement each other nicely. I don't know about you, but I quite like my greenhouse to look attractive. I want to be drawn in to go in there, and my garden too. So I do think about colour and interest quite a lot, which you might want to do as well, I don't know. And then there's a Thai basil, or cinnamon basil, which is also used for Thai cooking. That's more licoricey, and that is a green leaf, but with a purple flower. So those are the best varieties. There might be a couple of other more quirky varieties that you might find on the internet, but these varieties have all been tried and tested. And to be honest, it might be fun to grow some unusual things, but if you really want to eat from your greenhouse, I would personally choose the ones that are tried and tested and you get a good production from.